Hello, and welcome to the History of the Railways, a podcast with the ridiculous goal of telling the story of the railways across the world. Season 1, Episode 8, The Liverpool and Manchester Railway Part 3, Making it a Reality. Over the last few episodes, we've been looking at the birth of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. In episodes 4 and 5, we talked about the Rainhill trials, and in episodes 6 and 7, we looked at the line's struggles to overcome their opposition and get an act approved. We saw how the first attempt in 1825 failed when George Stephenson took a beating in Parliament, how the directors switched to recognised establishment engineers, overcame resistance from the landowners, and successfully got an act passed in 1826. Only to switch straight back to George as their engineer as soon as it was approved. And finally, we saw George evict the last remnant of those establishment engineers and install his own men on the line. Today, we'll work our way along the line, exploring some of the magnificent works of civil engineering that Stephenson's engineers oversaw, and get an idea of what building them might have involved if you were one of the nameless hundreds of navvies who did the physical work. And then we'll finish off by taking a look at the track itself. If you haven't heard the other episodes, then if you only want to hear about the building of the line and get an idea of how 19th century construction projects got built, then this episode can definitely stand alone. But if you want to know how the L&MR had reached this point, then I recommend going back and starting with episode 6 at least. I'll be here when you get back. Right, everyone up to speed who wants to be? Great. So, before we get started, we need to answer our last trivia question. On the last episode I asked, when was the first underground public railway opened? The answer is the 10th of January 1863. The 3 3/4 mile long Metropolitan line was a dual gauge line that ran under London from the GWR's Paddington station to a new station at Farringdon. On the first day, it carried 38,000 passengers, pulled by broad gauge 240T locos supplied by the GWR. OK, on with the show. So, when we stopped last time, we were at the beginning of 1827, and George had split responsibility for the line between 3 of his trusted lieutenants. Joseph Locke was now in charge of the Liverpool end of the line in place of Vignoles. William Allcard had been promoted to supervise the central section, and George had brought in John Dixon to manage the eastern end of the line approaching Manchester. That meant Dixon had the unenviable job of crossing Chat Moss, but we'll get to that in good time. The L&MR has many impressive works of civil engineering, including more than 60 bridges. In fact, the Liverpool and Manchester Trust have put together a great online map that shows those bridges and the original stations. I've put a link to it on the website at historyoftherailways.com/episode 8. It's well worth a look. But obviously there isn't time in a single episode to discuss all of them, and in any case, once we've covered the approach for each, the story will get a bit samey if we covered them in turn. So I'm going to focus on the best-known big projects, and 1 or 2 others that, in my opinion, don't get enough attention. And happily, that means we can talk about each type of structure, so we can get a sense of what went into each of them. And by coincidence, it will give us at least one from each of the sections that Stephenson divided the line into, which appeals to my sense of fairness to long-dead engineers. And we'll begin our journey at Liverpool with the Edge Hill Tunnel. We touched briefly on the tunnel in the last episode, as it was the thing that gave George Stephenson a reason, or excuse depending on your point of view, to get rid of the previous engineer Vignoles. But let's look at it now in a bit more detail. I pointed out in that episode that, despite what you might hear, the tunnel at Edge Hill wasn't the first tunnel to be built under a city. But that shouldn't detract from our appreciation of its scale. It was still a massive undertaking, and Terry Coleman was exactly right when he described it in his book on the navvies as the first of the great railway tunnels. The tunnel as it was finally built was 1.25 miles long, 22 feet wide and 16 feet high. It took about 18 months to build, and to get it done the men worked night and day, although that was a distinction that sadly won't have made much difference to the miners doing the digging. When it was finished, it was reported that, on very clear days, it is possible to read a letter at the distance of half a mile from the opening. And since not every day in Liverpool is very clear, the L&MR directors installed gas lights every 150 feet. With the light bouncing off the whitewashed walls, most visitors commented on how clean and bright it looked. Not so while it was being built. Whether they were working during the day or the night, the 300 navvies or so who laboured on it worked in a darkness broken only by the light of candles. So how did they do it? Well, I'm conscious that there's no way to describe this that doesn't sound a bloody sight easier than it really was, but here goes. To dig the tunnel, they used the same methods that the canal navvies had used before them, and which themselves owed a lot to centuries-old mining techniques. So that the tunnel could be completed as quickly as possible, it was started from several places at once. How? Well, the path of the line was marked out on the surface, and 5 or 6 shafts were dug 60 feet deep. The miners then tunnelled sideways from the bottom of these shafts until they met the men coming the other way. Once the shaft was complete, the men got to and from their work by a rudimentary lift, or elevator, I suppose, if you're listening in American. They would gather in a large bucket attached to a rope and pulley, and be lowered down by horses working the pulley on the surface. And if you're thinking, well, of course the horses were on the surface, why is he bothering to say that? Then I suggest you look up pit ponies. This was not a good time to be involved in mining, whatever species you happen to belong to. But back to the men. When they got to the face of the tunnel, lit only with candles as I said earlier, the men used compasses to check that they were tunnelling in the right direction. Surrounded by water running from the walls and ceiling and pooling at their feet, they worked their way through the clay, sandstone and shale with a combination of pickaxes, hammers and wedges and gunpowder. The gunpowder was sealed in tin tubes, placed inside a hole drilled into the rock surface, and then the powder set off. And just in case you're glossing over this, pause for a minute and think, even that last sentence implies a job that's just so much easier today. They put the gunpowder into a hole drilled into the rock surface. In 1827 there were no power tools. To drill a hole in the rock, you used a hand drill. The digging itself depended on the type of rock being tunnelled through. Sometimes there'd be men making a pilot bore, followed by another team widening the tunnel to the necessary width. And behind the miners would come the masons, laying bricks to support the roof. Until the masons built their arch, the roof would usually be supported by wooden props, but where the rock was hard enough, the men would instead dig 2 parallel tunnels that would make the sides of the finished tunnel, and leave a central column of stone supporting the ceiling. That pillar would then be removed as the masons finished the arch to make it secure. I can only imagine that the men must have felt safer when they could work in that way than when they relied on the wooden props, since cave-ins were an obvious hazard of this type of work. While tunnelling under Crown Street, for example, the roof collapsed, tipping 30 feet's worth of dirt and sand into the tunnel. Amazingly, we're told that nobody was hurt on that occasion, but that certainly wasn't always the case. In August 1827, the Liverpool Mercury noted the first recorded death in the tunnel of a railway navvy. I can't help but think there the key words are first recorded death, but still it's worth quoting. We are pained to state that a labourer who was working in the excavation of the railroad at Edge Hill, where the tunnel is intended to come out and join the surface of the ground, was killed on Monday last. The poor fellow was in the act of undermining a heavy head of clay, 14 or 15 feet high, when the mass fell upon him and literally crushed his bowels out of his body. He wouldn't be the last, although it's sad how few are mentioned specifically. But the small number we have still gives us an idea of the many and varied ways that building a railway offered its workers to die. We read of a man being crushed on his way up the shaft. Apparently the horse that was pulling the bucket was frightened by some idle boys. The horse bolted, the bucket rose out of control, and the unfortunate workman was trapped between the bucket and the wheel of the pulley. Then there was the, at least, 12 men who drowned while building the bridge across the River Irwell, when their overloaded boat hit the piles and overturned. And then in September 1829, in a foreshadowing of what was to come on the opening day, a man died when he incautiously placed himself in the way of the locomotive engine, and his leg was literally cut off. I can't help but say that the literally was part of a quote. It's not a word I use a lot. It does appear that the company often tried to do the right thing by the people these unfortunate workers left behind. When the men drowned in the Irwell, for example, the company paid for their funeral. And in his excellent book, The Railway Navvy, That Despicable Race of Men, David Brooke tells of a case where the L&MR gave the widow of a worker who died at Olive Mount money just to move to Essex, to be with friends. But usually the human cost to the navvies didn't draw much attention. As we'll see when we look at navvies in a later episode of their own, injury and death were simply an accepted part of what it took to get the job done. Something that was perhaps more easily accepted if you weren't the one getting injured and dying. Finally, though, in June 1828, the men broke through the last of the sections and it was possible to get from one end to the other. A year later, in mid-1829, the interior had been finished enough for the company to sell tickets to the people of Liverpool to walk through it. They cost a shilling, and there was even a band put on to entertain the guests. If any of those guests had extended their walk east for another mile or so beyond the tunnel, they'd have come to the next thing I want to discuss, the cutting at Olive Mount. Before the railway came along, Olive Mount was a sandstone hill. Stephenson's original plan would have avoided the area altogether, but Vignoles' revised line had taken the more direct route as part of the compromises to keep the landowners happy. On the plus side, that meant it avoided the contentious route of the original plan. On the downside, it meant it was necessary to cut through the hill. The cutting is 2 miles long, 20 feet wide, and between 60 and 70 feet deep. In fact, it was widened in later years to allow for more traffic, but it was 20 feet wide at the time it was built. To build it, the navvies had to dig and blast their way through 480,000 cubic yards of rock. Assuming it was all standard density sandstone, it won't have been, but go with me to get some numbers here, that meant shifting about 850,000 tonnes. I'm going to mention cubic yards several times through this episode. To get an idea of what that means in practice, then if you've got a pretty standard UK kitchen, just imagine a double-fronted cupboard. That's about the right height and width. It isn't quite deep enough, but if you imagine shifting that every time I refer to a cubic yard of something, it'll give you an idea. It's easier if you're in the US. Your washing machines are about a cubic yard, so just picture one of those. I'm planning to do an episode on navvies, as I say, so I'll go into more detail about the methods they used in that. But for now, it's interesting to note that while they didn't have any power tools, they did have at least one mechanical assistant. The 060 locomotive Twin Sisters worked in the Olive Mount cutting. Although today's episode isn't about locos, I can't help but spend a moment on Twin Sisters. It's an intriguing engine for a couple of reasons. As usual, there's a picture at historyoftherailways.com/episode 8. But to get an idea, picture 2 short vertical boilers, each with its own chimney and inclined cylinders. But quite apart from the look of the thing, it's intriguing for 3 reasons. First, it demonstrates the amount of experimentation that was going on at this point. Second, the fact that it had a boiler designed by Henry Booth, just like Rocket. And thirdly, that it burnt coke. That was essential for locos to legally meet the L&MR's Act, as we saw in episode 4, but it hadn't been done before. Still, interesting as it was, Twin Sisters couldn't help with the digging. That was down to the navvies with their pickaxes and hammers. When it was finished, the end result was a man-made canyon that, in the words of one early rider on the railway, was a deep and frightful gulf, not less than 2 miles in length. Its appearance inspires melancholy, mingled with a sentiment of curiosity. We remark the perpendicular heights of the sides of the road, and overhead, through a confined space, is seen the blue vault of the sky. Under Henry Booth, who, as we saw in episode 4, was the treasurer when that role meant so much more than it does today, the company sought to run an efficient operation. They looked to get as much value as they could from the line. In today's corporate lingo, they were sweating the assets. The Lancaster Gazette reported that the stone from Olive Mount was of very good quality, and the company are deriving considerable profit from the sale of this stone. In fact, they reused some of it themselves as well, using the stone and muck they excavated wherever they could to build the bridges and to form the massive embankments that were needed along the line, like the one running from Broadgreen to Roby. Which brings us to the last of the features I want to cover that Locke was responsible for: Broadgreen, or Roby, Embankment. When we think about the impressive feats of 19th century civil engineering, we tend to think of the bridges, the aqueducts and the tunnels, physical things that still stand out in the landscape. But almost as much effort went into earthworks that don't stand out anymore because they've become the landscape. Roby Embankment is between 2 and 3 miles long. The size of the embankment varies across its length, but at its tallest point it's 45 feet high, and its widest is 135 feet across. George Stephenson wrote that it took 550,000 cubic yards of material to build. Much of that came from Olive Mount. The embankment was made by end tipping, using a wagon that was designed by George himself. As the name suggests, end tipping involved running a wagon full of material to the end of a temporary track and tipping it over the end. In this way, the embankment grows across the landscape at its full height. This was faster than the alternative method, which we'll look at in the later navvy episode, but it meant that the embankment didn't have as much time to consolidate, a point that Thomas Telford was unimpressed about when he came to assess whether the L&MR should be allowed a loan from the Exchequer. Olive Mount and Roby provide a good example of what contractors saw as the ideal situation, an embankment close on the heels of a cutting, because it meant that the two could be worked as a single piece, excavate from one area and dump in another. Still, as I said earlier, easy to say, quite another thing to actually do it. Railway embankments like Roby were huge undertakings, and today we rarely think of them because it's just the ground. Easier to spot is the Sankey Viaduct. The viaduct stands between 60 and 70 feet high and has 9 brick-built arches, each 50 feet wide. It's Grade 1 listed because, as Historic England put it, it is of international significance, being the earliest major railway viaduct in the world. The Sankey Valley is relatively shallow, but it actually contains 2 waterways, Sankey Brook and Sankey Canal. Well, I say contains, contained is more accurate. The canal has been filled in since, but in 1828 they were both there and needed to be crossed. And to make matters more difficult, the Canal Company had insisted as part of the parliamentary approval that any viaduct would have 60 feet of clearance above water level, which was a bit tricky since it was higher than the land that surrounded the valley. George Stephenson's solution was to build embankments on both sides of the valley to raise the ground level and then to span both waterways with a single viaduct. Soon after William Allcard was given responsibility for this stretch of line, work started on the viaduct. And the next year was spent on the part you can't see, the foundations. If you count the abutments at each end, there are 10 piers holding up the bridge, but they're standing on ground that is too soft to support them, so before work could start on the piers themselves, Allcard needed to make decent foundations. He did this by driving 200 wooden posts or piles between 20 and 30 feet long into the site of each pier. By coincidence, John Rennie the Elder, the father of the Rennies who worked on the L&MR, had invented a steam-powered pile driver in 1801, but I can't find any reference to steam power being used at Sankey. Given Henry Booth's description that the heavy ram was hoisted up with double purchase and snail's pace to the summit of the piling engine and then falling down like a thunderbolt on the head of the devoted timber, driving it perhaps a single half-inch into the stratum below, is well calculated to put to the test the virtue of patience. It sounds like it might have been done by muscle power alone. Driving the piles in to form a solid foundation took the better part of a year, about as long as Allcard then spent building the visible parts of the viaduct. But those visible parts are really something. As I said earlier, it's made of brick, but it's faced with rusticated ashlar sandstone. Each pier sits on a plinth made up of 3 steps and narrows as it sweeps up towards the top of the bridge. The viaduct was finished in summer 1830, and the company were justly proud of the magnificent structure. It appears on commemorative medals struck from the time of the opening. You can see an example on the website and the History of the Railway's Facebook page. And before the opening day, the company, in their usual enterprising fashion, offered rides across it to paying customers. It's still in use today. As I said earlier, the canal has gone for now, and there have been some concrete repairs made in places, and recently overhead electricity lines were put in, but otherwise it's almost entirely the same as when it was built. You can look at it now and imagine it taking shape, first in the mind of George Stephenson, then under the pen of Thomas Gooch, and finally in the hands and pickaxes of the nameless hundreds who built it. William Allcard also had responsibility for the largest excavation on the line, just up from the viaduct, Kenyon. Kenyon is near the junction that would soon join the Bolton and Lee line to the L&MR, and depending on which source you use, it needed 700,000 or 800,000 cubic yards of material removing. To give you an idea of the size of the job, Booth says that to build the whole line they excavated 722,000 cubic yards of rock and shale and 2,006,000 cubic yards of marble, earth and sand, or what the contractors and navvies called muck. Assuming that the number is in the right ballpark, then nearly a third of it was dug out of the ground to make the cutting at Kenyon. And what happened to all of that muck? Well, some of it was used to form the Broseley Embankment just down the line, but unlike the embankment at Roby, this one didn't need all of the material that the cutting produced, so large spoil heaps were formed beside the line. In fact, the company had to buy land just to hold the muck that came from the digging. And then, a couple of miles after Broseley, is the edge of the fabled Chat Moss. The moss is, or at least was, a lowland raised bog made up mostly of peat. Raised bogs are formed when ground remains waterlogged and the plants growing on it die and don't fully decompose. The next layer of plants grow on top of those and the cycle repeats for thousands of years. The result is a spongy, boggy surface, which varies from the kind of damp field that will get your walking boots annoyingly muddy to a sort of filthy quicksand that will swallow anyone or anything that tries to cross it and drown them if they don't get out. Chat Moss had both. As Henry Booth said, the bog was, in some places, 30 to 35 feet deep, and so fluid that an iron rod would sink through by its own gravity. An iron rod, or indeed a man, as William James had found out years earlier, and John Dixon would on one of his first visits. The story of George Stephenson and Chat Moss has been told many times. The short version goes like this. During the 1825 failed attempt to get an Act of Parliament, the opponents of the line brought in experts to say the moss couldn't be crossed by a railway. But George Stephenson turned up, applied his real-world genius, probably saying something like, "Let there be rails," as he did it, and proved all of those book-smart establishment types wrong. But as we saw in the last episode, that isn't quite the whole story. It's essentially right. Some people did say it couldn't be done, and they were wrong. But conquering the moss wasn't a case of Stephenson having a flash of genius that let him see a solution lesser mortals couldn't. In reality, it was more tenacity than insight. What's that old adage about genius? That it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration? Well, that's definitely true here. Stephenson's original plan was to deal with the moss in the same way that he'd just finished crossing Myers Flat on the Stockton and Darlington Railway, tipping in material to make a solid formation for the track to rest on, basically building an underground embankment. And he had every reason to believe it would work, although, as I said in the last episode, that approach hadn't really worked at Myers Flat. It did look like it had when he was telling Parliament about it. Unfortunately, when the same approach was tried on Chat Moss, it quickly became apparent that the moss would swallow an unimaginable amount of material. Despite their belief that it could be done, everybody involved knew that the moss was going to represent a major challenge, so as soon as the Act was approved in June 1826, the directors instructed work to start on it. And remember, when George Stephenson was rehired, C.B.Vignoles was already supervising the cutting of ditches through the moss. The idea was to drain as much of the water away as possible before they started tipping in the material to make a reliable base. After George ousted C.B.Vignoles, Chat Moss fell to John Dixon. On his first visit, Dixon was apparently nearly scared off completely by the moss. In the account he wrote for Samuel Smiles, and on which Smiles would base his own version quite closely, he said, "I was walking along a plank, I slipped off and sunk up to my knees in the bog, and the more I struggled, the deeper I went. However, my awkward predicament being observed, the workmen came to my assistance. I was so discouraged that I wished to go back and leave the moss work to be carried forward or not by some other individual." Luckily, Joseph Locke persuaded him to stick at it. But as he spent months watching the material that was being tipped in to form embankments sink without a trace beneath the moss, there must have been times when he wondered again if the right thing to do was cut and run. Eventually, after hundreds of thousands of tons of material had been tipped in, the embankments along most of the 4 3/4 mile stretch of line across the moss breached the surface. Dixon and George Stephenson must have breathed a sigh of relief. However, there was still a part of the line where it became obvious that the approach wasn't going to work at all. They were going to need a different solution. According to a report read to the Manchester Geographical Society in 1885, it was a man called Robert Stannard who proposed a different idea. A stand of young larch trees nearby was bought, pulled up, and lashed together in a herringbone pattern to make a sort of raft. The raft was surrounded by heather and brushwood to give it more buoyancy, and then covered in rock, gravel and earth to form a base for the wooden sleepers that would then support the track. In this way, the track could float above the moss rather than disappear beneath it. It worked. Finally, by the end of 1829, track had been successfully laid from one side of the moss to the other, and the directors were able to make a, no doubt triumphant, journey across it behind Rocket. As Henry Booth said in what might be the best ever display of understatement I've ever heard, a little perseverance finally completed the work. It had taken 2.5 years, and the embankments consumed 677,000 cubic yards of material. But hey, just a little perseverance. Before we move on to the final part of today's episodes and discuss the track, I can't leave Chat Moss without a slight note of uncertainty. As I said earlier, it takes thousands of years to form an environment like Chat Moss was in the 19th century, but much of the moss has now been drained and the peat removed. That means an ecosystem that supported many plant and animal species is now all but gone. Several of those species are now endangered worldwide. There's now a group working to restore the moss, but once it's gone, it's very difficult to recover. Of course, work to convert the land of Chat Moss for human use didn't start with the L&MR, but the railway did give it a massive shot in the arm. While as railway and civil engineering fans we can marvel at the amazing combination of brain and muscle power it took to cross the moss, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it came at a cost to the natural world. Anyway, I'm not suggesting about an answer to the progress versus nature debate here, but it'd be daft not to acknowledge that there's an impact from the railway which wasn't all sunshine and roses. Okay, so we've seen some of the biggest projects along the line, but what of that line itself? What was the track that would be laid along this impressive formation? Well, as Andrew Dow said in his The Railway, British Track since 1804, there wasn't really any new track technology used. The line was a double track of 15-foot long fish-bellied rails made of rolled malleable iron using John Birkinshaw's design that I described back in episode 1. Each rail had 5 bellies, or ellipses, and was supported by 15-pound cast iron chairs. Joint chairs were used at the ends of the rails. The rails were pinned to the chair by a key, and normal chairs were also placed at the narrow part of each ellipse. More than half of the track stood on stone blocks, about 2 foot square. To secure the chair, 2 holes were drilled into the stone, and they were then filled with a wooden plug, usually oak, and the chair was pinned into the wood. A bit of maths gets you to the fact that there would have been about 3,500 stones for every mile of track. And obviously, since we're talking about double track, you can double that. We'll talk about how those stones were placed in the episode on navvies, but it's worth noting here that the 18 miles of track that were supported by stones would have needed more than 100,000 sleepers to be carried into position and placed securely. The remaining 13 miles of the line, usually where it ran over an embankment, but also including the 4 3/4 miles across Chat Moss, used wooden sleepers instead of stones. Most of the formation is topped with a ballast of stones, sometimes mixed with small coal, although in Olive Mount the stone sleepers were laid directly onto the floor of the cutting without ballast. The track itself is laid to what is now standard gauge, although the gap between the 2 tracks was much narrower than today. The standard of a 6'5" gap between tracks was established in 1837 on the London and Birmingham. The L&MR instead used the same gap between tracks as the gauge itself, the idea being that engines with wider trains could run up the centre, with a wheel on one rail of each track, if that makes sense. That probably sounded like a very good idea, but as we'll see in the next episode, it was a decision that would have serious consequences on the opening day. So come and join me then, in our last episode on this mini-series of the Liverpool and Manchester, when, since no discussion of the L&MR is complete without it, I'll do a quick rundown of the memorable events on the opening day. But we'll also go slightly further than that and discuss some of the developments in the line's first few years. But before we go, here's today's trivia question. The London and Greenwich Railway, the world's first elevated railway, was opened in sections between February 1836 and 1838. It ran on a viaduct into London, which when finished was almost 3.5 miles long. How many arches were in that viaduct? Listen to the next episode for the answer, and if you can't wait that long, then check out historyoftherailways.com, where you'll find show notes and the answer to today's question. So, come and join me on the next episode as we look at the early days of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. If you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can find relevant images and links to the source material I used for research on historyoftherailways.com, where you'll also find ways to support the show. If you want to get in touch, then just drop me a line at michael@historyoftherailways.com or follow us on Facebook and join the conversation there. So tell your friends to come and join us on the next episode as we get distracted, fascinated and yes, even sidetracked by the stories from the history of the railways.